Right.
Okay, perfect.
Okay, nice. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much for this introduction and also for all the organizers of the seminar. I also really enjoyed attending the other presentations. Um, so yeah, so my name is Jonathan Pardo. I'm a master's graduate of the Humboldt University in Berlin, and today I will present the paper, which is a joint work with Professor Sulin Sardasha, also from Humboldt University. Yes, about the attitudes of immigrants toward immigration. So first of all, to motivate the paper, as many of you probably know, immigration has really become a central political issue that is also polarizing much of the political debate in many Western democracies. That includes the United States and also many European countries. But at the same time, as immigration is steadily growing in those countries, also the electorate is becoming increasingly diverse. And by that, I mean that a larger share of the voting population is either born in another country or having some migration background. And just to give you a few examples, we see that in the United States in 2020, about 10% of eligible voters were in fact naturalized citizens, and a similar share of 12% in Germany in 2023 had a migration background. Uh, Sorry, doesn't it go? Sorry, yeah. So, as I said, so when such a substantive share of the voters are coming from this diverse background, it is becoming very important to understand whether this group has a specific policy preference, as this might have a substantial impact on the political outcomes in those countries. And while there's a lot of work that have been done already to understand the determinants of the political preferences of natives, and in specifically also in response to immigration, it is less researched, especially in economics, how immigrants are shaping their views, and in particular also how they respond to further immigration. So, so theoretically, immigrants may respond to immigration either similar to natives, or they may also have particular reasons to respond in a distinct way. And we also know that traditionally immigrants do hold more positive views to immigration than natives. But some recent examples show us that immigrants in some places are becoming perhaps more skeptical to immigration. And for example, we can see that in the United States, many Hispanic voters were voting for Trump in the recent elections. And also in Germany, we see large numbers of people with migration background that are supporting the far-right AfD party, which is openly anti-immigration. And then And this then raises a natural question whether what we are seeing is a process of political assimilation, where the views of immigrants are converging to those of the natives, and if so, whether exposure to new inflows are affecting this convergence. So in other words, we're asking whether exposure to immigration have a distinct effect on immigrants than it has on the natives. And ex ante, this could go in both ways. So while on the one hand, immigrants may feel solidarity or kinship with the newcomers and therefore hold more positive views to immigration, or at least have a less negative effect compared to the natives. On the other hand, the newcomers may also be better substitutes, for example, in the labor market to the existing immigrants than they are to the natives, and this will create stronger economic competition, which may also increase negative or more larger skepticism toward immigration among the immigrants, more so than among the natives. And another perhaps non-economic channel that may also be operating here is that when immigration increases, also the salience and the visibility of being an immigrant as a social category is also now more visible. And immigrants perhaps would like to self-distance themselves from this category, especially if it is associated with a certain bad social stigma attached to it. So to study these questions, we collected year-by-year migration data at a subnational level for 137 regions within 15 European countries. And we combined this migration data with individual level survey data from the very popular European Social Survey that has a rich set of information about both political attitudes and also sociodemographics. And we are using this data to construct a leave-out version of the shift-share instrument, and which we combine with the triple difference design, where essentially we compare the differences in the pro-migration attitudes between natives and immigrants who are living in the same region and the same year, but across regions with different levels of predicted migrant shares. So just very quickly, what we find, and I will, of course, elaborate later on in the presentation, but so we first of all document that indeed immigrants are holding more positive views to immigration when they first arrive to the country, but this is sharply declining with time in the country. And when we compare them to the attitudes of the natives, we see that this gap in attitudes is in fact converging. So we see that within 20 years since they arrived to the country, this gap in attitudes is shrinking by half. And this is already after we condition on individual level observables and when we compare the attitudes within the same region and year. And then we also see that this convergence is in fact becoming stronger when when the regions are exposed to more inflows. So yeah, the exposure to newcomers in fact do contribute to this convergence. So first of all, what we find is that both the natives and the immigrants both reacting more negatively in response to new inflows. But the first generation immigrants are responding about 40% more negatively. On the other hand, we don't find such differential effect among the second generation immigrants, so they respond quite the same way as the natives do. When we try to understand a little bit the underlying mechanisms, we cannot fully disentangle the mechanisms that are operating here, but we do document several heterogeneities in the data that are kind of that at least are not purely going along with a purely economic explanation. So we're looking at different questions that capturing different dimensions of opposition to migration, and also we look at heterogeneities across different types of respondents and different types of migrant inflows. And yeah, and as I said, we see that the patterns that we find are not purely this economic competition channel, which is perhaps the most intuitive one. At last, we also don't find evidence that immigrants and natives are differentially sorting into regions by their attitudes. So it is more likely that the results that we find are more driven by actual shift in the preferences rather than immigrants and natives that already have different attitudes that are moving to different regions in response to the exposure to migration. So a little bit about the background of the research. So this period in Europe is characterized by persistent immigration growth that is also have cross-regional variation in the exposure to migration. And in these 2 decades, immigration really have been the main driver of population growth, where immigration by far contributed more to the growth in Europe than natural population. And this was mostly driven by 2 phases of mass migration to Europe. The first one occurred during the early 2000s with the EU enlargements. So in 2004 and 2007, Central and Eastern European countries have joined the EU as new member countries. And then this led to large inflows from those countries into the former EU countries, so mostly Western and Northern European countries. Then a second phase of mass migration happened in what is known as the 2015 refugee crisis, where we saw large inflows of humanitarian immigrants from conflict areas in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and other countries. And so this combination of, on the one hand, long-run immigration growth that is also interacted with the refugee crisis that really brought the migration issue into to be such an important political issue in those European countries really serves as an ideal setting for our research. And now I also want to show you a little bit the cross-regional variation that we are using. So first of all, these are the regions that we are looking at. And on the left-hand side, we see kind of the initial conditions, so before the period of our analysis. So we see here the share of foreign-born population at 1991. And then on the right-hand side, we see the aggregate inflows during the period of our analysis between 2001 and 2022. And we can see how the regional variation in the initial conditions are kind of translating later also to heterogeneity in the exposure to the inflows later in our period of analysis. So the data that we're using, the main source, as I said, is the European Social Survey. So for those of you who are not familiar with it, it's a biannual large-scale survey that is conducting face-to-face interviews across many countries in Europe. We're using 11 rounds of this survey that is covering the period of 2002 until 2023. And we are using the rich information that the survey has on the specific birthplace country of the respondents and of each of their parents to define these three groups of analysis. So first of all, we define first-generation immigrants as those who were born in another country, but we restrict them only to those who arrived more than 5 years ago to the country, because we're interested in the effect of the immigrants that have already been living there when the inflows arrived. And we want to avoid analyzing the shift in preferences of the newcomers themselves. Then secondly, the second generation immigrants are those who are born in the country but have at least one foreign-born parent, and natives are, of course, those who both of their parents are born in the country. Then we define our main outcome variable as an index that captures pro-migration attitude. So we construct it as the first principal component of three question items that are capturing the views on migration on three different dimensions. So the first one is a question that asks about the economic implications of immigration. The other one captures the cultural implications of migration, and the third one is just the general influence on the country that the respondents are. How the respondents think what is the general influence of immigration on the country. So I want to give you, sorry, I think my links that don't work. Okay, yeah. So just to give you a little bit about the differences between our samples, we can see here just the averages of the individual characteristics between the three samples. And as you can see, first and second generation immigrants are slightly more likely to live in urban areas. They're slightly more educated, and also they are more leaning to the left politically. On the other hand, first generation immigrants have a little bit lower household income, and of course, only 62% of them are holding citizenship, compared to the other two groups that almost 100% of them are holding citizenship. This is nothing here is too surprising, but I think it's also, oh, sorry. Okay, I don't know, perhaps my buttons don't work here, so yeah, so as I was saying, so I was describing the data. Beyond the survey data, we also have we also collected regional migration data from various sources. So from the EU Labor Force Survey, we collected annual regional data for foreign-born stocks at working age, and we complemented it with data from the national statistics offices of the destination countries whenever it was missing. Then we have from the paper of Alessina et al. 2021, we got the regional migrant stocks by the specific birthplace or nationality, but mostly by birthplace, from the censuses of 1991. So they collected it from the censuses and population registers of the destination countries. And we also have annual national inflows by origin. So here it is by the nationality of the immigrants that we gather from the OECD International Migration Database. On top of that, we also collected several regional characteristics at the baseline of 1990. And there we have regional population data, regional GDP per capita, employment shares by sectors, and also regional voting shares to parties that we classified as opposing immigration. Then, first of all, we document the little bit the descriptives. Just we document the raw data here. So here, this plot we plot the average pro-migration attitudes of the first-generation immigrants by their arrival cohort. So these are the averages weighted by the survey weights of each of the groups of years since they arrived to the country, and we see here how immigrants indeed start with very positive views, but this is drops at about 70% after 20 years since they are living in the country. But we still see that even after 20 years, they hold relatively positive views to migration. These, as I said, these are standardized values. So relative to the mean, which is 0, that is the mean over the full sample that has also the natives and the second-generation immigrants. So positive values means that they are still relatively more positive than the full sample. Then when we compare the attitudes to the attitudes of the natives, we also see that the attitudes actually converge with time. So here what we see, the blue bars, they show the unconditional differences in means in the pro-migration index between the natives and the immigrants. And the red or pink bars condition this means difference on region by year fixed effects and on the bunch of individual level controls that are detailed here below. So basically what we can see is that the gap between the attitudes of immigrants and natives who are living in the same region and were surveyed in the same year and also have a similar socioeconomic profile. So this gap is shrinking by about 50% within 20 years that the immigrants are arriving to the country. So this suggests that there is some genuine convergence in the attitudes rather than only capturing compositional differences between the samples by the individual characteristics or some regional sorting of the immigrants. So after we established that on average immigrants' attitudes are indeed converging toward the natives' views, we want to understand whether new inflows contribute to this convergence. And to do so, we estimate how the regional migrant shares are affecting differentially natives and immigrants. So we estimate this triple difference, this equation in the triple difference this setting with multi-way fixed effects. So we use here the same as our outcome, the same index that I was explaining about earlier. And basically the coefficient of interest here, the betas, so we will have two beta coefficients here, one for the first generation immigrants and the other for the second generation immigrants, which capture the differential effect of the regional migrant shares on each of these groups relative to the natives who are the reference category here. We also include a rich set of fixed effects. So we have region by year fixed effects, group specific region fixed effects, and group specific time fixed effects. And I will explain a little in the next slide about the intuition of what exactly it captures. And also we have regional controls at the baseline time of 1990 that we interact with group specific time fixed effects. So we have here for the regional controls, we have the log of the regional population and GDP. At last, we also include a bunch of individual level controls. So perhaps beyond regular socio demographics, it is also worth noting that we add the years since arrival of the immigrants and also dummies for the specific country of birth of the respondent and of each of the parents of the respondents. So what are we capturing with this fixed effect structure? So first of all, As I said, region by year fixed effect captures any unobserved shocks that in the same region and year that is affecting all groups in the same way. So we can imagine, so regional economic cycles are captured by these fixed effects. So regional economic cycles that are affecting both natives and immigrants in the same way. Then we have group-specific time fixed effects. So these will capture any unobserved factors that are changing over time, but affect the groups differently across all regions. So for example, we can imagine some European-wide policy that is affecting the attitudes of immigrants and natives differently, but it is the same policy for all regions and is affecting the same way all regions. So this will be captured by this fixed effect. Then we have group-specific region fixed effects. So this will account for any time invariant factors that are affecting groups in a different way and also in specific regions differently. So for example, if there is some persistent sorting of immigrants into different regions, and this will be captured by that, or also just the average regional differences in the preferences of immigrants and attitudes across regions also will be captured. Then at last, we have the baseline controls that are interacted with the group-specific time fixed effects, and this captures the initial regional conditions that could have a differential effect on the groups over time. So because we have here the population and the GDP, this basically captures the possibility that urbanization and economic growth are affecting immigrants more than they do so for the natives. And yet, what is not captured then? So the regional immigration flows may still be correlated with region year shocks that are differentially affecting immigrants and natives' attitudes. So, for example, if there is some time varying immigration policy that is, on the one hand, attracting newcomers into the region and therefore having larger inflows into this region, but at the same time also affects the attitudes of the existing immigrants in a different way than it does so for the natives, this will still be a concern for our identification. So to address this concern, we construct the very popular shift share instrument, and we're constructing the leave-out version of it. And for those of you who doesn't know, I will give just the intuition. So we basically take the origin-specific migrant shares at the baseline in 1990, and we interact these origin shares with the aggregate inflow from each of these origin country into all the countries of destination in our sample, except the country of observation. So this is the leave-out version of it. And because we're interested in the predicted share of the migrants in the region, we scale this term here by the local population at 1990, and we're using the 1990 population counts because we want to avoid the endogeneity also in the denominator. Here, it's just a visualization of the relationship between the actual migrant shares and the instrument at the region year level. So every dot here, every point here refers to a region and year. And we see that after partialing out region fixed effects and country by year fixed effects, we have this positive relationship, which is also statistically significant. We also, of course, also show formally this relationship with the F statistics in the 2SLS estimations. Here I will be very brief, but just following the recent literature on shift share instruments, we want to be very clear about the assumptions that we're still making here. So in order for our instrument to be valid, we basically require that conditional on the fixed effects and the controls that we use, the attitudes gap between the natives and the immigrants would have counterfactually evolved similarly in regions that, on the one hand, have different historical settlement patterns, so the shares are different. And then also they would counterfactually evolve similarly in regions that experience different origin-specific shocks. So these are the shifts. And if I will have time, we're doing several things in the robustness checks that kind of alleviate most of the concerns about these two assumptions that we're making. Yeah, that show that the assumptions are most likely holding. This is what I meant. So um, I will now go to showing the main results. And here I showed the 2SLS results, and every time I show this is not the final specification, but this now has only the year fixed effects and region fixed effects and all the individual level controls. And I will gradually show you will add the other fixed effects to show you how they influence the results. So first of all, what we can see is that the overall effect of the regional migrant shares is negative on the attitudes, but it is more negative among the first generation immigrants. So the interaction term is significantly negative. And what we can see is that among the second generation immigrants, we don't see this effect. Also important and reassuringly, we see the average effect of the two groups that it is positive without the interaction term. So as I also said before, immigrants, both first and second generation, are holding relatively, on average, more positive views to immigration. Um, then once we add region by year fixed effects, this absorbs the average effect of the regional migrant shares, but the pattern remains the same for the first generation differential. Then when we add year by group fixed effects, this absorbs the group specific averages, but again, the similar pattern holds. And then also this remains the same when we add the baseline controls interacted with the year and group fixed effects. At last, we add the region by group fixed effect that is accounting for the persistent sorting of across regions. And now we see that the first generation differential is the largest. Um, so we can say that this change in the size of the effect is driven almost completely from the weaker first stage. We can see here the statistics that are lower. And I will... Yeah, so on the reduced form here, the coefficient size, this is the last specification, and in the reduced form, we see that the coefficient size remains stable. So this is almost entirely driven by, uh, okay. Sorry, I don't know why my buttons don't work. But yeah, as I said, the change in the size is driven almost entirely from the weaker first stage. So perhaps the magnitude should be taken with a grain of salt here. I also do want to show you the we also analyze this effect by by every group separately. So this is so here we can see that all the groups are reacting more negatively to the larger migration shares in the region, but the first generation immigrants are responding 40% more negatively than the other two groups. So this is kind of reassuring for us to say that the differential that we saw in the interaction term before is not driven by perhaps natives that are becoming more positive toward immigration. So kind of to conclude this section, we can say that the convergence in the preferences are perhaps not only driven by assimilation and diffusion of norms, but also it could be because immigrants and natives are exposed to the same local shocks, in this case, immigration shocks. So what could explain this amplified effect that we found among the first generation immigrants? So first explanation could be that this is because immigrants are perhaps more exposed to economic competition and fiscal competition than natives are. New arrivals can affect wages and employment of the immigrants more than they do so for the natives. So this can be one explanation. Another explanation could be that, as I said in the introduction, this can be something that has to do with the social identity of the immigrant. So heightened visibility of the immigrant category may lead to self-distancing of the immigrants to signal assimilation. Then at last, if immigrants are perhaps more interacting with the newcomers than the natives do, it can, well, according to context theory, this perhaps could dampen the negative effect, but it can also mean that they are more exposed to the newcomers, and then this may enhance the other two channels that I explained before. And while we cannot fully disentangle these mechanisms from one another, I will show you several heterogeneity exercises that kind of suggest that at least that several channels are at play here and not only this economic competition channel. So first of all, we look at different outcome variables instead of only the pro-migration index that we had. Here, the estimates in these coefficient plots are representing the interaction term of the first generation immigrants. And the top three outcomes here are the components of the index that we use to construct the index. And what we see is that along all of the dimensions, we see a greater opposition of the first generation immigrants. So perhaps not all precisely estimated in the same way, but we see that it is not restricted only to the economic or only to the cultural dimension. Then we also look at other outcomes, so other political preferences. So we're looking at attitudes to further EU unification, attitudes to redistribution, and also left-leaning on a left to right political scale. And again, we see that there is a general shift in the attitudes, kind of all of them more to the left, so to say. And yeah, and this is maybe more consistent with this assimilation, this general assimilation to the natives' preferences, or yeah, perhaps not just this pure economic competition. And then we also want to check how the results are varying across different characteristics of the respondents, but also we want to see how the heterogeneity in the respondents' characteristics is varying not just by how many newcomers arrive, so this is our main effect, but also how they respond to who are the newcomers. So we will also look at compositional effects of the immigration inflows. So what we do, we split the sample by, we split the immigrant sample by the characteristics of the respondents. So we look at the skill of the occupations that they have, educational attainment, so primary versus non-primary education, and also the origin. So we look at immigrants from OECD and non-OECD country of birth. And then we also look at the time, if there's some heterogeneities across different times that they live in the country. And as I said, we first look at the level effect. So this is captured by the regional migrant shares. This is the same measure that we used so far. But we will also look at the compositional effect. So here we focus on the skill composition of the migrant inflows, which is captured by the share or the ratio of the primary educated immigrants out of the total migrant stock in the region. And because this can also be endogenous, we follow here an instrument that CARD 2009 are using that is basically capturing the ratio. It's the same leave-out shift share instrument that is capturing here the changes in the ratio between the predicted primary educated immigrants relative to the predicted total stock of immigrants. And what we find is, so first of all, regarding the level effect, heterogeneity by the characteristics, what we see here, so this is the coefficient from the 2SLS regressions only for the first generation immigrants, but on different subsamples. And as you can see, the immigrants in low-skilled occupations are reacting more negatively than the immigrants in the high-skilled occupations in response to higher migration shares in the region. And the difference in the coefficients is marginally insignificant. So this is almost significant, but yeah, not but kind of above the threshold. And we see a similar pattern also by education, but it is less precise. And on the other hand, we don't see similar heterogeneities by other characteristics. Now, when we are looking at the compositional effect, so what we see here is quite the opposite. So immigrants in high-skilled occupations are reacting more negatively to the deterioration in the skill mix of the inflows than immigrants with low-skilled in low-skilled occupations respond. And here, the difference between the coefficients is statistically significant. On the other hand, again, we don't see differences along other characteristics. Yeah. So at last, and how much time do I have? 2 minutes. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So just very quickly, we also, as I said, we try to look at the differential sorting, so we don't find evidence for that. So we basically try to understand whether exposure to local migration is also predicting differential mobility across regions of immigrants with certain attitudes or not. And we don't find such evidence for that. We also try to look not only at the skill composition, but also at the origin composition. So we can look at non-EU share of immigrants out of the total stock. We do have some issues here with the weak first stage, but we can say that we don't find heterogeneities along this effect. And then at last, out of this idea of repeated exposure to shocks, we also try to look, and this is still at work, we try to look at not only how the contemporaneous migrant shares are affecting, but also how the cumulative migration growth since the arrival of the immigrants is affecting their attitudes. And here, yeah, we also find a negative effect. And then we also have a bunch of robustness checks. We add more baseline regional controls that we have for only subsample of the regions and more individual level controls. And the results remain stable for all of these robustness checks, also different clusters. And yeah, and when we looked also at the heterogeneities by the cohort of arrival, we also tried to check different cutoffs. So we looked at below or those who live more or less than 20 years in the country. So we also try to do different cutoffs, and we also see no heterogeneity along this line. So just to conclude, we find that exposure to local migrant shares indeed reduce pro-migration attitudes, both for natives and for immigrants. The response is significantly stronger among the first generation immigrants. And when we look at different questions, we find a broad-based opposition along both economic and cultural concerns of the immigrants. Then we also saw that low-skilled immigrants are reacting more to the increase in the size of migration, while the high-skilled immigrants are reacting more to the deterioration in the skill composition of the newcomers. And this is perhaps more going, yeah, it is perhaps not so consistent with a purely economic explanation, because we would expect that the low-skilled would respond more strongly to larger composition of low-skilled immigrants in the region. But it is important to say that we cannot fully disentangle these mechanisms, and this is perhaps an important direction for future research to understand which of these two channels are perhaps more doing more work here. And another direction for future research would be to maybe look at whether this shift in preferences is also translating later to actual electoral outcomes. Yeah, because this is again not something that we look into. So thank you so much for listening, and of course I will be very happy for any feedback and suggestions for what we can look more at. And yeah.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was excellent. Now we're going to open the floor first to Frederica for the discussion. And then after that, we'll help manage more discussion if anyone from the audience or any of the other panelists has comments or questions. But we'll start with Frederica for your 10-minute discussion.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I want to say that, should I share my screen?
Yes,
Yeah,
please.
sorry. So can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. So first of all, I want to say that I really enjoyed reading this paper, so I was very lucky. I was even like this paper your paper generated a lot of debates amongst my colleagues, because I was really it really got my attention. So congrats on that. So just a brief summary of what was presented. So you ask whether migrant preferences over immigration converge to those of natives over time. And you test two potential mechanisms. One, whether this may be driven by cultural assimilation, or the second one, whether this may be driven by repeated exposure to migration inflows. And you combine two different methodologies. So on the one hand, you do a difference estimator comparing natives first generation and second generations within region year cells. And then to overcome endogeneity concerns, you also do a shift share instrument using the share of migrants from specific origin in a given region and the stuff of immigrants from that origin since the 1990s. And I want to say that, like, actually, most of the points that I will address have been discussed, have been answered throughout the presentation. So most of these are, I guess, mainly suggestions or even things that were not necessarily clear to me while reading the paper. So in terms of results, it seems that first-generation immigrants arrive with strong pro-immigration views, but these attitudes converge to those of the natives over time. And this is what you argue is that this is mostly driven by exposure to local immigration. So increases in local migrant share reduce pro-migration attitudes of both natives and immigrants, but response is significantly stronger for first-generation immigrants, which is something I was not expecting, to be honest. And it seems that second-generation migrants behave as natives, so they respond exactly the same. And this is incredibly relevant because, as you say, when you motivate the paper, immigration has become a major political topic in Western democracies, and immigrants are becoming a larger share of voters across all Europe and the US as well. And there is a standard view that actually a more diverse setting tends to lead to more pro-immigration policies, whereas you show that it can actually work exactly the opposite way. So immigrants can actually become political gatekeepers. And it's incredibly new and relevant in the sense that you shift focus from natives to long-term migrants, which is a much less studied sample. And overall, I think the paper is extremely relevant and it's very timely. So this is this is at the heart of current economic debate. So in the sense, like, I think it captures attention like automatically. You know, like, I think there will be common interests in your paper. So the first comment that I have regarding the index is that it's not clear to me because I've been through the European Social Services and surveys, and I know that they have a lot of variables related to migration. And I would like to understand why you choose these three variables specifically. I understand the economic, cultural, and I'm forgetting the third one, but the three aspects. But it seems like I think, like, perhaps you could try a bigger index, or you could, like, do robustness checks with different index variations. For instance, I think that the European Social Services have these kind of variables. Like, do you think that migrants are threatening, you know, like literally testing your hypothesis, which is that there is this threat to my job if migrants come in? I think, I don't know, that there could be variations of the index that you could explore. And also you could explain in the paper why you choose these three variables specifically. Um, Also, but this is more, I'm new to shift chair. I'm also trying to do a migration paper with a shift chair instrument. And I was wondering, like, why you stick with 1990, because I think it's in a sense harmful for you because the share of migration from specific origins only started later, right? So I think you'll have a lot of zeros, and so you will lose information by using this as a reference here. So I'm not sure if you considered, like, trying variations where you use, like, later years to as a reference point. I don't know. I'd like to hear what you did. And also it would be interesting, like, just to as a maybe an appendix table or whatever, but to understand, like, well, actually you do this when you show the maps here, but I don't think it's in the paper, at least in the version that I saw. Like, what are the origin country baseline shares, which is, I think you addressed this during the presentation. So I think this comment is obsolete now. And so in the triple difference, this doesn't apply, but this is due to my limited knowledge of shift chair, which is a new literature to me that I'm trying to understand. But from the way you construct the shift share instrument, it seems that you're focusing on inflows from migration exactly from the same origin, right? Because the share is composed of migrants in that region over with compared to using as a denominator the overall share from migrants in that region in all from that origin, sorry, in all regions, right? And when you interact that with the flow is also from migrants from that origin. So I guess what you're saying is that like, and this is I'm looking at my setting, which is Portugal. So if I'm a Cape Verdean migrant and I've been living in Portugal for 20 years, then if I'm exposed to lots of Cape Verdean migrants coming to my country, then I become more negative. Is this what you're suggesting? Because in your framing, it seems that it's exposure to migration overall, but then in the shift share, if I understand correctly, you're just focusing on inflows from the same origin. And I think like in a sense, like I understand why you do this, but also like you could also test, like I think it would also help your paper if you like test both, like also with migration from overall countries. But yeah, also I would like to hear more thoughts, like why you set the IV like this. Yeah, and I guess like you addressed this during the presentation. So I think like this is more of a format comment than anything else. Like in the introduction, what I got was that, which is what I put on my first slide, but then when I saw you presenting, I think it's different. It seemed that there was one research question. No, sorry, I'm mixing. No, this is a previous comment still. So you talk about two mechanisms, but I think there is one which you don't really explore, which is the cultural assimilation. So I'm not understanding whether you mentioned cultural assimilation, like you use the second generation as the ones that are culturally assimilated. Is this what you're trying to say? Or if not, like, why don't you also test for cultural assimilation in more detail? Like, you can look at variables such as like which language you speak at home, what is your religion, what type of job do you have? Like, is it a more formal or informal job? And like, did you do any education in the country? So like this kind of aspects of cultural assimilation, I think you could, if you mention this in the introduction, you could further explore it a bit, I would say. Yes, and finally, this is the comment that I had, which is, it seemed to me when I was first reading the paper that you have one research question, which is, do migrants' preferences over migration converge to those of natives? But then, like, so what I understand is that I'm not sure whether you have two research questions or one, and the conversion driven by exposure to new arrivals is your proposed mechanism or is also a research question. I think in the introduction, this is still a bit mixed. From your presentation, it seems that it's also a research question, which is fine. But I think like maybe like explaining this better in the introduction would help you. Like just yeah. But overall, like I really really enjoyed reading the paper, and I would love to discuss more when maybe we can chat over email, and I will send you the slides for sure. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much for that discussion. So Jonathan, I guess now if you would like to respond, you don't have to respond to everything, but just any comments or immediate reactions, and then pass it on to have the discussion with the audience.
Yeah, so Frederica, first of all, thank you really so much for the comments. I would be happy for the slides. It was really also, I think some points are very relevant and require clarification. And um, so, yeah, so first of all, why we used these specific variables. You're right that the ESS has many variables concerning migration attitudes. But these three are so this is more like a data limitation. So these three exist along all the rounds and in all the regions. So this is really for the to increase the sample size. Um, but we also, I mean, we don't have it in the paper, but we also did have some checks with, we tried to do like an index that takes only the questions that has to do with economics, like you said about taking the jobs or not, and then another index that is only constructing questions about more cultural issues. But yeah, then again, this is only, I think, in two rounds of the ESS, they have this module for migration. Um, but perhaps this is useful also to maybe show that why we use the 1990 shares for the shift share. So this is kind of like there is a trade-off, I would say, in shift share instruments where you want, on the one hand, to that the instrument will be exogenous. So you want to the more far you go back, it, it is less likely that these shares are correlated with the current shocks or whatever. But yeah, you're right to say that this is also there's a risk that you're losing the